She heard the floorboard creak at 4 in the morning and chose to keep her eyes closed. That one decision cost her daughter-in-law everything. Eleanor Whitfield lay perfectly still under the quilt her mother had stitched 60 years before, listening to the soft, deliberate sound of someone easing open the drawer of her nightstand. She knew that creak. She had lived in this house for 43 years, and she knew every sound it made, the way some women know the sound of their own heartbeat. The third floorboard from the bed always groaned when weight shifted onto it a certain way, and only a person who had walked this room in the dark many times before would know exactly where to step to avoid it, and exactly where they would fail. Vanessa failed. She always did. Eleanor did not open her eyes. She kept her breathing slow and even, the way she used to breathe when Lily was a colicky baby, and Eleanor had rocked her through the night, pretending to be asleep herself so the child would settle. She felt the faint vibration of fingers sliding along the wood of the drawer. She heard the soft, papery whisper of a checkbook being lifted free of its little elastic band, and she felt, more than heard, the held breath of a woman who believed she was being very, very careful. She was not careful enough. She never had been. Eleanor's late husband, Frank, used to say that patience was the only inheritance worth leaving anyone, because money could be spent and land could be sold, but patience, once a person had it, could not be taken from them by anybody. Frank had been gone 2 years that spring, and Eleanor had spent those 2 years learning exactly how right he'd been. She listened to Vanessa's bare feet pad back across the carpet, pause at the bedroom door, and slip out into the hallway. The door did not click shut. It never did. Vanessa had learned, over 6 years of marriage to Eleanor's son, that a door pulled closed too firmly made a sound, and Vanessa did not believe in sounds that could be traced back to her. Eleanor opened her eyes to the gray ceiling and did not move for 11 minutes. She counted them on the small clock radio Frank had bought her in 1998, the one with the red digital numbers that still worked perfectly, because some things built decades ago simply refuse to break. Then she sat up, slowly, the way her knees required these days, and she looked at the nightstand drawer, left open 2 inches, exactly as Vanessa had left it. Inside, beneath a stack of expired coupons and a rosary that had belonged to her own mother, was the space where a checkbook had been sitting for 4 months. A checkbook drawn on an account that had been closed since March. If you have ever sat at your own kitchen table and realized the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones circling closest, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because Eleanor's story is one you are going to want to remember the next time somebody underestimates a quiet woman in a small house. By the following Friday, 4 separate checks had moved through a dealership 60 miles away, totaling $14,000, every one of them signed in a hand that was trying very hard to look like Eleanor Whitfield's careful, old-fashioned cursive. And when the calls started coming, when the panic and the accusations and the shouting filled her son's kitchen like smoke, Eleanor Whitfield said almost nothing at all. Because she already knew something none of them did. That account had been dead for months, and every single one of those checks was now a felony. To understand how a 71-year-old widow ended up lying in the dark listening to her own daughter-in-law rob her, you have to go back further than the morning the creak woke her. You have to go back to the kind of small, quiet cruelties that never make it into anyone's court records, because they are not crimes. They are just the slow erosion of a person, one careless comment at a time. Eleanor had married Frank Whitfield in 1976 in a church with a leaking roof and folding chairs borrowed from the fire hall, and for 47 years, the two of them had built something modest and solid together, a 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane, A small hardware store Frank ran until his hands got too unsteady to count out nails. 2 children, Daniel, who was sweet and easily led, and Karen, who was sharp-tongued and had left for Denver the moment she turned 18 and never looked back with any regret. Frank died of pancreatic cancer in the spring 2 years before that morning, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral. Eleanor had nursed him in the back bedroom, had learned to give injections with hands that shook, had held his hand while a hospice nurse checked his pulse for the last time, and had walked out of that room a widow at 69 years old with a modest life insurance payout, a paid-off house, and a son who suddenly needed her more than he ever had, mostly because his wife needed things from her. Daniel had married Vanessa Cole 8 years earlier, at a wedding Eleanor still remembered for its extravagance, an open bar that ran nearly $4,000, a band flown in from Nashville, a dress that Vanessa had told anyone who'd listen cost more than Eleanor's first car. Eleanor had smiled through the whole thing, because that is what mothers do, and because Daniel had looked so happy standing at that altar that she couldn't bring herself to say what she already suspected, that Vanessa loved things more than she loved people. The small comments started almost immediately. At Thanksgiving the first year, Vanessa had looked around Eleanor's dining room, the same table Frank had built with his own hands in 1981, and said brightly to another guest, "Isn't it charming? Very vintage." At Christmas, she'd handed Eleanor a gift card to a store that had closed 2 years prior and laughed it off as an honest mistake, though Eleanor noticed she never once apologized for the oversight, only for Eleanor's supposed overreaction to it. "You're imagining things again, Eleanor," Vanessa liked to say. It became something of a signature, a little verbal tick she reached for whenever Eleanor questioned her about anything at all. A missing serving dish, a comment overheard, a strange charge on a shared subscription. It happens at your age. It happens at your age. As if 70 was a diagnosis, as if noticing things clearly was itself a symptom of decline. Daniel rarely defended his mother in these moments, not because he agreed with his wife, Eleanor believed, but because he had learned, the way water learns the shape of a riverbed, that disagreeing with Vanessa cost more energy than it was worth. He would change the subject. He would laugh a little too quickly. He would find somewhere else to look. Eleanor watched her gentle boy shrink, year over year, into something smaller and more careful, and she grieved that almost as much as she grieved Frank, because at least Frank's leaving had been a single, clean wound. Watching Daniel disappear by inches was a slower kind of loss, one with no funeral to mark its passing. There was one bright thing in all of it, though, one small, warm light Eleanor held on to through every uncomfortable dinner and every backhanded remark. Lily. Lily was 8 years old that morning, with Frank's same crooked smile and an unshakable habit of climbing into Eleanor's lap uninvited, the way children do when they've decided, correctly, that a person is safe. Lily called her Grandma Elle and drew her pictures of cats with too many legs and told her, solemnly, every single week, that Eleanor's chocolate chip cookies were the best in America, maybe the world. It was Lily, more than anything, who kept Eleanor showing up to those dinners. It was Lily who Eleanor thought of, later, when everything came apart. Because whatever else happened, whatever Vanessa cost her, Eleanor was determined that little girl would never learn to be afraid of the truth. Karen, out in Denver, saw all of it from a distance and had exactly 0 patience for any of it. "Mom, she is using you," Karen had said more than once over the phone. "You need to stop being so nice about it. She's your brother's wife," Eleanor would answer gently. "I have to try." Eleanor did not yet know how close trying was about to bring her to disaster. Because somewhere in that 8-year unraveling of small comments and careless dinners, Vanessa had stopped seeing Eleanor as a person to be tolerated and started seeing her as a resource to be managed. And resources, Vanessa believed, did not need to be asked before they were used. The first sign came 14 months before that morning, though Eleanor did not recognize it as a sign at the time. She had been going through her bank statement, the paper one, mailed monthly, because Frank had never trusted the internet with money, and Eleanor had simply continued the habit after he passed, and had noticed a charge she did not remember making. $41 and change at a boutique 2 towns over, a store Eleanor had never once set foot inside. She'd called the bank. A polite young man had explained that the charge had gone through on her debit card, chip read, in person, at 10:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, when Eleanor had been sitting in her own kitchen doing a crossword puzzle. She'd frowned at that, filed it away as some kind of clerical error, and moved on. People make mistakes. Banks make mistakes. Except the following month, there was another one. $63, a different store. The month after that, $85. Never enough individually to trigger any fraud alert. Never enough to seem urgent. Small enough, Eleanor realized much later, to be exactly the amount a person tests with before they decide to try something bigger. She mentioned it to Vanessa once, carefully, over coffee, thinking perhaps her daughter-in-law had borrowed the card for something and simply forgotten to mention it. Vanessa did, after all, run occasional errands for her when Eleanor's knee acted up. "Vanessa, honey, did you happen to use my card last month? There was a charge I didn't recognize." Vanessa had gone very still for exactly 1 second. Eleanor remembered that stillness later, replayed it in her mind 100 times, and then had laughed, light and easy, and said, "You're imagining things again, Eleanor. It happens at your age. Maybe write things down more." Eleanor had let it go. She told herself she must have simply forgotten a purchase, that 71 was, perhaps, exactly the age where a person's memory started to soften at the edges, that she owed it to herself to be humble about the limits of an aging mind. But something in her, something quiet, something that had spent 47 years married to a man who ran a hardware store and never once let a set of books go unbalanced, refused to fully accept that explanation. Eleanor had always been a careful woman. She had never, not once in her adult life, lost track of where her money went. And she found, in the weeks that followed, that she could not stop thinking about that 1 second of stillness before Vanessa's laugh. That was the moment the seed was planted. Though Eleanor didn't recognize the shape of it yet, it would take root slowly over the following months, until it grew into something that would eventually cost Vanessa everything she had. She had no idea a trap was already beginning to form around her, one careless charge at a time. It was Walter Higgins who first put a name to what Eleanor had been feeling. Walter had lived 2 doors down from Eleanor and Frank since 1994, a widower himself, and before he retired, he had spent 26 years as a fraud investigator for a regional bank. The kind of job that teaches a man to notice patterns other people walk right past. He and Frank had played cards together every Thursday night for 2 decades, and after Frank passed, Walter had simply started showing up on Eleanor's porch on Thursdays anyway, with a thermos of coffee and a deck of cards, because he understood, in the quiet way older men sometimes do, that grief needs company more than it needs conversation. One Thursday evening, about 5 months before that morning, Eleanor mentioned the strange charges almost in passing, the way a person mentions a small worry they've decided not to take seriously. Walter did not laugh it off. Walter set down his coffee cup very carefully on the little wicker table between them and said, "Eleanor, how many of these charges have there been now?" 3, I think, maybe 4. "And do they get bigger each time or smaller?" Eleanor thought about it. "Bigger, a little." Walter nodded slowly, the way he used to nod at a stack of suspicious statements back when it was his job to notice such things. "That's called testing the water," he said. "Somebody's checking to see how much they can take before anyone notices. Small amounts first. See if it triggers questions. If it doesn't, they get braver." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You think someone is stealing from me?" "I think," Walter said carefully, "that you should pull your statements for the last year, side by side, and look at every single line. Not just the ones that seem odd, all of them." She did exactly that same weekend, spreading 12 months of bank statements across Frank's old dining table, the one Vanessa had once called charming in that particular tone that meant the opposite. And there it was, laid out in black and white, undeniable once she was finally looking for it instead of around it. 14 unauthorized charges over 11 months, small ones at first, progressively larger, all at stores and gas stations within a 30-mile radius of Vanessa's usual routes. Total damage, $2,160. Eleanor sat at that table for a long time after she finished adding it up, one hand pressed flat against the polished wood Frank had sanded smooth with his own two hands, and she let herself feel, fully and completely, just once, how much it hurt to realize that the woman her son loved had been quietly picking her pocket for the better part of a year. Then she wiped her eyes, folded the statements into a neat stack, and did something that surprised even herself. She decided not to confront Vanessa at all. Not yet. Because Eleanor Whitfield had learned in 71 years on this earth that a wounded animal backed into a corner does not surrender. It bites. And if Vanessa was capable of stealing $2,000 a few careful dollars at a time without a flicker of remorse, then confronting her directly, with no proof beyond Eleanor's own bank statements, which Vanessa would surely claim were simply the confused bookkeeping of an old woman, would accomplish nothing except tipping Vanessa off, and possibly turning Daniel against his own mother in the process. No. Eleanor decided she needed something Vanessa could not laugh away. She needed proof so clean, so undeniable, that not even Daniel's loyalty could argue with it. She called Walter back the following Thursday and asked him a single question that would end up changing everything. "Walter," she said, "if I closed this account completely, moved everything out, shut it down for good, could someone who didn't know it was closed still try to write checks against it?" Walter's eyebrows had gone up slowly. "For a little while, yes. Checks aren't verified against a live balance the instant they're written. Somebody could write one, and it would look perfectly normal on the surface. It just wouldn't clear. It'd bounce back marked as drawn on a closed account." "And is that worse?" Eleanor asked slowly. "Than an ordinary bounced check? Legally, I mean." Walter set his coffee down again, and this time he looked at her with something like genuine surprise. And maybe, Eleanor thought later, a flicker of pride. "Eleanor Whitfield, are you thinking about setting a trap?" She hadn't answered him directly that night. She had only asked him, very quietly, whether he still knew anyone at the bank's fraud division, and whether he thought a person could be prosecuted for knowingly writing checks on a closed account. Walter had told her the truth, plainly, the way he always did. "That's not simple bad judgment anymore, Eleanor. Writing checks you know are worthless, on an account you know is closed, with intent to obtain goods or services. That's uttering a forged instrument. That's a felony charge in this state, depending on the amount. That's not a family squabble anymore. That's a crime." Eleanor had sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the dark street where Frank used to walk their old dog every evening, a street that had not changed much in 40 years, even as everything inside her own family quietly had. "Good," she said finally, very softly. "Then that's exactly what I intend to build." She had no way of knowing, that Thursday evening on her own front porch, just how soon Vanessa would walk directly into it, or how much money would be gone by the time she did. Eleanor moved carefully after that, the way a person moves when they understand, for the first time, that they are not simply managing an awkward family relationship, but quietly preparing for war. She did not use that word lightly, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. War. It was not a word Eleanor Whitfield had ever expected to attach to her own quiet life, to a house on Larkspur Lane with its worn porch swing and its rose bushes that needed trimming every June. But she found, turning the word over during the long, sleepless hours that followed her conversation with Walter, that it fit better than any gentler word might have. This was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over with a careful conversation and a plate of cookies. This was a woman who had spent 11 months quietly helping herself to what was not hers, who had looked Eleanor in the eye and told her, more than once, that she was imagining things. A woman like that did not respond to gentle conversation. Eleanor had tried gentle conversation. Gentle conversation had gotten her a laugh and a lecture about her own advancing age. She thought, that night, of something Frank used to say about the hardware store, back when Daniel was still small enough to ride on his father's shoulders through the aisles of nails and paint cans. There had been a young man Frank hired one summer, a nephew of a neighbor, sweet-faced and eager, who had started, slowly, skimming small amounts from the register. $1 here, $3 there. Frank had noticed within 2 weeks, he always said a man who balanced his own books every single night could feel a wrongness in the numbers the way you feel a stone in your shoe, long before you ever see it. But Frank had not confronted the boy right away. He had watched, quietly, for a month, documenting every discrepancy in a small ledger he kept in the back office, until the pattern was so complete and so undeniable that when he finally sat the young man down, there was no room left for excuses, no possible claim of confusion or coincidence. People will lie to your face as long as there's a crack of doubt to hide inside of, Frank used to say, closing that old ledger with a soft, final sound. Your job isn't to catch them in the act. Your job is to leave them nowhere to stand once the truth comes out. Eleanor had not thought of that story in years. It came back to her now with a clarity that felt almost like Frank's hand resting on her shoulder, steady and certain, the way it used to when she doubted herself over some smaller decision decades before. She was not being cruel, building a case in silence instead of shouting her suspicions from the rooftop. She was doing exactly what her husband had taught her, without either of them ever calling it a lesson at the time. She was leaving Vanessa nowhere left to stand. The following afternoon, she called Karen in Denver, though she was careful, even then, about exactly how much she said. Karen had always run hot where Vanessa was concerned, quick to anger, quicker still to want to drive the 12 hours home and settle things with her own 2 hands. And Eleanor did not yet want to hand her daughter a reason to do something rash before the ground beneath them was solid enough to hold the weight of it. "Mom, you sound strange," Karen said, the moment Eleanor's voice crossed the line. Karen had always been able to hear things in her mother's tone that other people missed. A habit, Eleanor suspected, born of growing up the second child in a house where the older sibling required most of the attention, leaving Karen to become sharply, almost unnervingly perceptive about everyone around her instead. "What's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," Eleanor said carefully. "I only wanted to ask you something. Do you remember at Daniel's wedding when Vanessa's mother mentioned she'd worked in collections for a credit agency years back?" There was a pause on the line, and Eleanor could almost hear her daughter's mind sharpening, the way it always had, even as a girl, whenever something did not sit quite right. "I remember that whole side of the family talking about money like it was oxygen," Karen said slowly. "Why, Mom? Why are you asking me about this now?" Eleanor chose her next words with care, the way she had chosen every word since that first strange $41 charge appeared on her statement months before. I think Vanessa may have taken some money from me over the past year. Small amounts. I'm handling it, sweetheart. I only wanted to know if there was a pattern in her family, something I should understand before I decide what to do. Mom, Karen's voice had gone flat and cold in a way Eleanor recognized instantly, the exact tone her daughter used at work, she suspected, right before firing someone. How much money? A little over $2,000 so far. So far, Karen repeated. Mom, that woman has been robbing you for a year, and you're telling me about it over the phone like you're mentioning the weather? I am telling you, Eleanor said gently but firmly, because I trust you, and because I need you to trust me right now more than you've ever trusted me about anything. I am not going to let this go, Karen, but I need to do it my way, and my way is slow and quiet, and it is not going to look like anything is happening at all for a while. Can you give me that? Can you let your mother handle this without driving 12 hours home and making it worse? There had been a long silence on the line, long enough that Eleanor wondered if the call had dropped. And then Karen exhaled, a sound that carried 8 years of frustration Eleanor recognized all too well. I have hated watching her talk to you the way she talks to you since the day Daniel brought her home, Karen said quietly. I have wanted to say something at every single dinner. I didn't because you kept telling me to let it go, to keep the peace, to give her the benefit of the doubt. I am done giving her the benefit of the doubt, Mom. Whatever your way is, I want in on it. Not driving home and screaming at her in your driveway. I mean actually in it. Tell me what you need. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she'd realized. The particular loneliness of carrying a suspicion no one else yet believed. I need you to be patient a little longer, she said softly. And when the time comes, I am going to need a witness who has no reason to protect her. That's going to be you. She did not tell Karen that evening about the closed account, or the checkbook still sitting untouched in the nightstand drawer, or the conversation with Walter about felony charges. Those pieces were not ready yet. But she felt, hanging up the phone that night, that she had taken a small, necessary step. She was no longer entirely alone in what was coming, even if the shape of it was still forming in the dark. There was a harder call still to make that same week, one Eleanor put off for 3 full days before she finally forced herself to dial the number. Her pastor, Reverend Combs, had known Eleanor and Frank since before Daniel was born, had officiated Frank's funeral, had sat with Eleanor in the hospice room during those final, terrible hours. Eleanor did not call him for absolution exactly. She did not believe in her heart that she was doing anything wrong. But she wanted, badly, to hear someone she trusted completely tell her that patience was not the same thing as cowardice, and that building a quiet case against a person who was actively stealing from her was not, in fact, a betrayal of the grace she'd spent her whole life trying to practice. Eleanor, Reverend Combs said, after she'd laid out the barest outline of the situation, careful, as she'd been with Karen, to keep the sharpest details tucked away for now. Grace does not mean allowing yourself to be harmed indefinitely in the name of peace. Frank used to say something to me once, years ago, about running that store of his. He said the most loving thing he ever did for a dishonest employee was to make sure the consequences arrived clearly enough that the young man could not mistake them for anything but what they were. Sometimes the kindest boundary is the clearest one. You are not required to suffer quietly to prove you are a good woman. You have already proven that, 1,000 times over, in 1,000 smaller ways nobody but the Lord ever saw. Eleanor had cried a little at that, sitting alone in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear. Not from sorrow exactly, but from the sheer relief of being told, plainly, that she was allowed to stop absorbing what was being done to her. There was one more thing she needed before she felt steady enough to move forward, and it came to her not through a phone call or a conversation, but through a small, ordinary moment 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon when Daniel dropped Lily off for a few hours while he ran errands. Lily had come tumbling through the front door in her school uniform, breathless with excitement, clutching a slightly crumpled piece of construction paper covered in crayon. "Grandma Elle, look! Look! I got a gold star on my family tree project," Lily announced, thrusting the paper toward her. There, in careful, wobbling 8-year-old handwriting, beneath a drawing of stick figures holding hands, was a small paragraph the teacher had asked each child to write about someone in their family they admired most. Lily had chosen her grandmother. "My grandma always tells the truth, even when it's hard," the paper read, in Lily's careful, uneven print. "She makes the best cookies, and she never lies to me, not even a little." Eleanor had sat very still, looking at that paper for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what those simple, misspelled sentences were asking of her. A child had already decided, without any of the evidence Eleanor was so carefully assembling, that honesty was the thing her grandmother stood for above all else. Eleanor understood, holding that paper in her hands, that she was no longer only protecting her own dignity, or even simply seeking justice for the money that had been taken from her. She was protecting the truth of what that little girl believed about the people who loved her, a truth Eleanor intended to make sure remained solid ground beneath Lily's feet, whatever else came apart around her in the months ahead. She pinned the paper to the refrigerator that evening, in the same spot Frank used to hang Daniel's report cards decades before, and she looked at it every single morning after that, a quiet, steady reminder of exactly why patience and proof mattered more than anger ever could. By the following Sunday, Eleanor had made her decision fully, without a shred of doubt left in her. She would close the account. She would build the case, methodically, the way Frank once built his ledgers, one careful entry at a time, until there was no room left for anyone to argue that she had imagined any of it. And she would do it quietly enough that Vanessa would never see it coming. Not until the exact moment Eleanor intended for her to see it, and by then, it would already be far too late to matter. She slept better that Sunday night than she had in weeks, the checkbook still resting undisturbed in its drawer, the decision already made, the first true step of it waiting for her only a day away. The first thing she did, the following Monday, was drive to First Heritage Bank and sit down across from a young branch manager named Mr. Doyle, a serious young man with kind eyes who had, coincidentally, once worked briefly under Walter Higgins before Walter's retirement. Eleanor did not tell him everything. She told him only what he needed to know, that she believed a family member had been making unauthorized charges to her account, that she wanted to close that account entirely and open a new one, under her name alone, at a different institution, and that she wanted the closure to be quiet. No letters mailed to the house, no paper trail sitting on the kitchen counter where anyone might find it. "I understand completely, Mrs. Whitfield," Mr. Doyle had said, and something in the careful, unsurprised way he said it told Eleanor he had seen this particular story before, in one form or another, more times than either of them wanted to count. "We can flag the account for closure and route all notifications to your new address exclusively. It'll be as if the old account simply stops existing from your family's perspective." "And the checkbook?" Eleanor said. "The physical one. What happens to checks written against it after it closes?" "They'll bounce," Mr. Doyle said. "Every single one. Marked NSF, drawn on a closed account. And Mrs. Whitfield, if someone writes those knowing the account is already dead, that's not just an inconvenience for the payee. That's fraud on paper, with a signature on it. It's about as clean a case as fraud investigators ever get." Eleanor had nodded slowly and made a decision that would have startled anyone who thought they knew her. Anyone who had only ever seen the soft-spoken widow who brought casseroles to church potlucks and let her daughter-in-law's cruelty roll off her like rain. She told Mr. Doyle to leave the old checkbook exactly where it was, in her nightstand, untouched. "You want to leave a live checkbook in the house?" Mr. Doyle said carefully. "On an account you're about to close." "I want to leave a checkbook in the house," Eleanor corrected gently, "that only I know is already dead." It was a decision that felt, in the weeks that followed, almost unbearably heavy at times. Eleanor would open that drawer late at night, look at the checkbook sitting there in its worn leather cover, and wonder if she was doing something cruel, something almost dishonest, laying a trap for a woman who was, after all, the mother of her only granddaughter. But then she would think of Lily, asleep down the hall in the room that used to be Daniel's, and she would think of the $2,160 quietly siphoned away over 11 careful months, and she would think of Vanessa's cool, easy laugh. "You're imagining things again, Eleanor. It happens at your age." And her resolve would settle back into place like a stone dropped into still water. She was not setting a trap out of cruelty. She was setting it because she had tried patience, and patience had been mistaken for weakness. Over the following weeks, Eleanor built her case the way Frank used to balance the books at the hardware store. Slowly, carefully, with every single number double-checked. She kept a private notebook, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of an old cookbook on her kitchen shelf, documenting every prior unauthorized charge with dates, amounts, and locations. She met with an attorney Karen had recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez, who reviewed everything Eleanor had gathered and told her, plainly, that she had more than enough documented pattern behavior to support a civil claim even without the trap, but that if Vanessa took the bait on the dead account, criminal charges would very likely follow as well. "You understand," Ms. Alvarez had said, leaning forward across her desk, "that once this account closure is discovered, there's no putting it back in the drawer. If she writes even one check against it, this stops being a family matter you can quietly manage. It becomes a police matter. Are you prepared for that? For what that might do to your son's marriage? To your granddaughter?" Eleanor had thought about that question for a long moment before answering. "I have spent 2 years being the person everyone assumes will simply absorb whatever happens to her," she said finally, quietly. "I am tired of absorbing things, Ms. Alvarez. My husband built a life for us on honesty and hard work, and I refuse to let that be the last thing standing between my family and the truth." She had no idea, sitting in that office, just how quickly the truth was about to arrive, or how expensive it would be. 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, Daniel came home from work and told Vanessa he'd found the truck of his dreams. He had no idea what he was about to set in motion. Daniel had wanted a truck for as long as Eleanor could remember. Something practical for hauling equipment on weekend jobs, he always said, though Eleanor privately suspected it had more to do with the sleek, chrome-heavy models he'd point out on the highway, like a boy admiring a toy in a store window. He and Vanessa did not, by that point, have $14,000 sitting in savings. They had, by Eleanor's quiet observation over the years, very little sitting in savings at all, a fact Vanessa worked hard to hide behind a rotating collection of new handbags and a leased SUV that always seemed to need replacing right around the time the lease ended. Eleanor learned about the truck the way she learned most things about her son's household. Secondhand, at a Sunday dinner, watching Vanessa's face while Daniel talked. "It's a beautiful truck, Mom," Daniel said, practically glowing, showing her photos on his phone of a dark gray pickup with a lift kit and leather seats. "Dealers got it priced right, but financing's tight this year, you know how it is. We're trying to figure out the down payment." Eleanor had glanced at Vanessa across the table, and Vanessa had smiled that particular smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to appear generous in front of witnesses. "Don't worry about it, baby," Vanessa said, patting Daniel's hand. "I'll take care of it. I always take care of things." Eleanor had smiled politely and passed the mashed potatoes and said nothing at all, though something inside her had gone very still, the way a hunter goes still when she hears movement in the brush. She did not know, at that Sunday dinner, exactly how Vanessa intended to take care of it. She only knew, with a certainty that felt almost like grief, that whatever Vanessa was planning would not involve Vanessa's own money. 3 weeks passed. Eleanor watched and waited and said nothing, and tried very hard not to let her hands shake when Vanessa mentioned the truck again at another family dinner, glowing about how they'd found a way to make it work. Then, on a Thursday night, Eleanor went to bed at her usual hour, said her evening prayers the way she had every night since Frank passed, and slept lightly, the way she had slept ever since Walter first said the words "testing the water" to her, all those months before. At 4 a.m, she heard the floorboard creak. She lay still. She listened to the drawer slide open. She listened to the checkbook lift free of its band. She listened to Vanessa's careful, silent retreat back down the hallway, back to the guest room where she and Daniel were staying that weekend while their own house had its floors redone. And when the door did not click, when the house went quiet again, Eleanor Whitfield opened her eyes in the dark and felt something settle inside her that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some quiet, aching combination of both. "There it is," she thought. "There it finally is." She did not get up. She did not confront anyone. She lay there until the gray light of dawn crept through the curtains, and then she rose, made her coffee, and called Walter Higgins at 7:15 in the morning, earlier than she had ever called him in the 28 years she'd known him. "Walter," she said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. It happened. Eleanor sat with the phone pressed to her ear and said nothing further for a moment, letting those 2 words hang in the quiet of her kitchen, the way smoke hangs in still air before it finally begins to drift. It happened. She had rehearsed saying it 100 times in her mind over the preceding months, lying awake in the dark, wondering what her own voice would sound like the morning she finally had to speak the sentence aloud to someone other than herself. She had imagined it coming out broken. She had imagined her voice cracking the way Daniel's would crack, weeks later, at this same table. Instead, it had come out steady, almost matter-of-fact, and she found herself faintly surprised by her own composure, the way a person is sometimes surprised by their own reflection in an unexpected mirror. She looked down at her free hand resting on the counter and noticed, with a strange, detached clarity, that it was not shaking. Her hand had shaken plenty over the preceding year, the morning she'd first spread 12 months of bank statements across Frank's old dining table, the afternoon she'd sat across from Mr. Doyle and asked him to leave a checkbook untouched in a drawer, the evening she'd told Karen over the phone exactly how much money had already been taken from her. But it was not shaking now. Now there was only a strange, settled stillness, the stillness of a woman who had spent months preparing for a single moment and had finally, without fanfare, arrived at it. She thought, briefly, of Frank, the way she often did in moments that mattered. Not a grand or dramatic thought, Just a small, ordinary image of him standing at the register of the hardware store, closing out the day's receipts with the same careful, unhurried patience he brought to everything. He would have liked how calm she sounded just now, she thought. He would have told her that composure, in a moment like this, was not the absence of feeling, but the evidence of how thoroughly she had already felt it, alone, in the many quiet months before this phone call. She let her eyes drift toward the hallway, toward the closed door of her own bedroom, where the checkbook had sat undisturbed in its worn leather cover for 4 long months, waiting, the way a seed waits beneath frozen ground for a season it cannot yet see coming. She thought of the exact weight of that drawer sliding open in the dark, the particular, deliberate slowness of it, the 2 inches and no more. She thought of counting 11 minutes on Frank's old clock radio before she'd allowed herself to move, lying rigid under the quilt her mother had stitched 60 years before, listening to her own heartbeat keep time with the silence of the house around her. She thought, too, of Lily, asleep 2 doors down the hallway of her own home that same night, in the room that would one day, Eleanor hoped, still feel like the safest room the child had ever known, regardless of everything that was about to come apart around her. Eleanor had made her decision, in that instant, the same decision she had been quietly making and remaking for months every time her resolve wavered. That whatever this call set into motion, whatever it eventually cost the family gathered so carefully around this fragile, ordinary life on Larkspur Lane, it would not cost Lily her belief that the people who loved her told the truth, even when the truth arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, wearing someone else's hands. She became aware, gradually, of the silence stretching out on the other end of the line, longer than the ordinary pause of a man simply listening. She did not fill it. She had learned, over 28 years of Thursday evenings on that porch with Walter, that he needed silence sometimes the way she needed it herself. A beat to let hard news settle fully into its proper shape before either of them tried to speak around it. Outside her kitchen window, the first full light of morning was beginning to spread gold across the lawn, catching on the dew still clinging to the grass Frank had planted the year Daniel was born. And Eleanor found herself thinking, absurdly, that it was a beautiful morning for something so terrible to have finally, quietly, become real. Walter did not say anything at first. Eleanor could hear him setting something down on the other end of the line, the soft clink of a coffee cup meeting a saucer, the particular silence of a man giving himself a moment to absorb news he had been half expecting for months and had still, somehow, hoped might never come. "Tell me everything," he said finally, his voice low and steady, the same voice he must have used decades earlier, she imagined, sitting across a desk from some anxious branch manager reporting a discrepancy in the books. "Don't leave anything out, Eleanor, not even the small parts. Especially not the small parts." So Eleanor told him. She told him about the floorboard, the third one from the bed, the one that always groaned under a certain kind of careful weight. She told him about lying still, keeping her breathing slow and even, the way she used to breathe for Lily as a colicky infant so many years before. She told him about the drawer sliding open exactly 2 inches, no more, no less. The same distance it had been left when she'd checked it that very afternoon, which meant Vanessa had opened it slowly enough to measure the sound against her own nerve. She knew exactly what she was doing, Eleanor said, and she was surprised to hear how calm her own voice sounded, saying it aloud for the first time. There was no fumbling, Walter, no hesitation. She has been in that room before. She knew precisely where that checkbook was. "Of course she has," Walter said quietly. "People don't just wander into somebody else's nightstand by accident, Eleanor. That takes reconnaissance. That takes opportunity and patience, and probably more than one visit where she was simply looking, not yet taking. Eleanor felt something cold settle low in her stomach at that thought. The idea that Vanessa might have stood in that same bedroom on other nights, other visits, quietly cataloging what she might one day need, while Eleanor slept 2 feet away, utterly unaware. She thought of every holiday Vanessa and Daniel had stayed over in the guest room across the hall. She thought of every time she had handed Vanessa a spare key so she could let herself in to water the plants while Eleanor visited Karen in Denver. She thought of how much trust, offered freely and without a second thought, had quietly been turned into a map. I heard her go back down the hallway, Eleanor continued, steadying herself. The door didn't click. It never does with her. She's learned exactly how much pressure it takes to close it without a sound. That's not carelessness, Walter said. That's practice. They sat with that for a moment. 2 old friends on either end of a phone line at 7 in the morning, both of them turning over the same uncomfortable truth, that whatever else Vanessa was, she was not impulsive. She was not a woman who had made one desperate, unplanned mistake in a moment of financial panic. She was a woman who had built, quietly and deliberately, a set of skills for taking what she wanted without leaving fingerprints, and she had been sharpening those skills for the better part of a year before she ever touched that drawer. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked, and there was something almost young in the way she asked it. A flicker of the same uncertainty she used to feel decades earlier, calling Frank at the hardware store whenever a customer complaint felt bigger than she knew how to handle alone. "First," Walter said, and she could hear him settling into the rhythm of a man laying out a plan the way he must have laid out 100 plans before, back when this had been his actual job instead of a favor for an old friend. "We do not do anything visible. Not yet. If you call the bank today and ask them to flag activity on that account, that's fine, that's smart, but it needs to happen quietly, through Mr. Doyle directly, not through any general customer service line where a note might get left in a system Vanessa could somehow access if she ever went digging." "I can call him this morning," Eleanor said. "Do that," Walter said. "Tell him what happened. Ask him to flag the account so that the moment any check clears against it, or attempts to clear and gets rejected, someone notifies you directly and personally, not through an automated letter that might sit on a counter for a week before anyone reads it. We want to know the instant something moves." Second thing, I'm going to make a call myself, this morning, to a man I used to work with named Carl Esposito, who still sits on the fraud desk over at the regional office. He'll know exactly how fast a returned check gets flagged as potential fraud versus just an ordinary bounce, and he can make sure this doesn't get buried in some routine queue. Eleanor felt a small, unfamiliar warmth move through her at that, a feeling she hadn't experienced in longer than she wanted to admit. The sensation of not being entirely alone in a fight she'd assumed, for months, she would have to wage by herself in the quiet of her own kitchen. "And Ms. Alvarez," Eleanor said, "should I call her today as well?" "Today," Walter confirmed. "Tell her exactly what you told me. She'll want to start documenting the timeline immediately, while it's fresh. The exact time you heard the drawer, the exact time you called me, everything. In situations like this, Eleanor, the timeline is almost as important as the evidence itself. It shows premeditation on their side, and it shows restraint on yours. Judges and juries notice restraint. It's one of the few things that still seems to matter to people, even now." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the folder Ms. Alvarez had shown her weeks earlier, the one already thick with a year's worth of documented statements, growing heavier now with every passing hour. I keep thinking, she admitted quietly, about what happens to Daniel in all of this. He still has no idea, Walter. He's going to wake up one morning and discover that his wife emptied a dead checkbook into a truck dealership, using my name to do it. And I am the one who is going to have to watch his whole world come apart in front of me. I know, Walter said gently. And I wish I could tell you there's a way to spare him that. There isn't, Eleanor. There never was. Not from the moment Vanessa decided $2,000 in small stolen charges wasn't enough for her. You didn't create this. You only made sure it couldn't hide any longer. I know that, Eleanor said softly. I do know that. It doesn't make it easier to imagine his face. No, Walter agreed. It won't. But Eleanor, think about the alternative. If you'd said nothing, if you'd let this go the way she clearly expected you to, what does Daniel's life look like in 5 years, 10? A wife who has already proven she'll forge his own mother's signature to get what she wants, given free rein because nobody ever stopped her the first time. You're not the one hurting him, Eleanor. You're the one finally protecting him, whether he understands that today or not. Eleanor let that settle over her, the way she'd let so many hard truths settle over the preceding months, and found, slowly, that it steadied her the way Walter's words so often did. She thought of Lily's careful, crooked handwriting on that construction paper still pinned to her refrigerator. My grandma always tells the truth even when it's hard, and felt her resolve harden back into place. There's something else, she said after a moment. I keep wondering whether I should warn Daniel. Not about all of it, just enough to prepare him for the fact that something difficult is coming. Walter was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried the particular gravity of a man who had watched this exact question play out badly more than once over the course of a long career. I'd advise against it, Eleanor, and I want to explain why, not just tell you no. If you warn Daniel now, even gently, even with the best intentions, there's a real risk he says something to Vanessa without meaning to. Not out of disloyalty, out of habit. Married people talk, Eleanor. They mention things in passing that seem harmless, and if Vanessa gets even a whisper that you know the account is closed, that you're watching, she may panic and either stop entirely, which means you lose your proof, or worse, she may try to cover her tracks in ways that make this messier and harder to prove later. The kindest thing you can do for Daniel right now, as strange as it sounds, is let this play out exactly the way it's already unfolding, without interference. Eleanor nodded slowly, though there was no one there to see it. You're right. I know you're right. I only wish being right made it feel less like a betrayal. It isn't a betrayal, Walter said firmly. It's a kindness with very sharp edges. Those aren't the same thing, even when they feel similar from the inside. They talked for a while longer about smaller logistics, which days Eleanor typically saw Vanessa and Daniel in the coming week, whether Eleanor should act normally at any family gatherings that might occur before the checks cleared, how she might explain her calmness if anyone happened to notice it. Walter reminded her, gently, that grief and shock did not always look the way people expected them to, and that if anyone later asked why she seemed so composed once the truth came out, the honest answer, that she had already lived through the worst of the shock months earlier, quietly, alone, at her own kitchen table, would be more than sufficient. One more thing, Eleanor said before they hung up. Karen knows a little of this already, not all of it. I told her, a few weeks back, that I suspected Vanessa of taking smaller amounts. She's been asking to be included in whatever happens next. Good, Walter said without hesitation. You'll want a witness in your corner who has no reason to protect Vanessa and no history of looking the other way where she's concerned. Bring her in fully once the checks actually move, not before. The fewer people who know the exact shape of the trap before it closes, the less chance there is of anyone, even accidentally, giving it away. There was a pause on the line, and then Walter said very quietly, "How many checks do you think she'll write?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." Neither of them could have guessed that Friday morning just how fast the $14,000 would move, or how quickly the whole carefully built trap would begin closing shut around a woman who still had no idea she'd walked directly into it. The checks moved faster than even Eleanor had anticipated. The first one cleared the dealership system on Monday morning, a deposit of $4,000 meant to secure the truck and begin the financing paperwork. The second came Wednesday, another $4,000, described later by the finance manager as an additional good faith payment to move the process along. The third and fourth checks, both for $3,000 each, were written Thursday and Friday respectively, the final push to cover what the dealership called documentation and delivery fees, the kind of soft, vague language that lets a nervous, excited buyer hand over money without asking too many questions. Vanessa had been thorough. Eleanor gave her that much later, when she finally sat down and reconstructed the whole sequence of events with Ms. Alvarez and Detective Renner from the local police department's financial crimes unit. Vanessa had written each check with careful precision, in a hand that mimicked Eleanor's own looping signature closely enough that a busy dealership finance office, working quickly and trustingly with a woman who introduced herself as Daniel's wife, picking this up for his mother, she's not great with driving out this far anymore, never thought to question it at all. $14,000. Written against an account that had held nothing at all in it for 4 months. The first sign of trouble came the following Friday, when the dealership's finance office called Daniel directly, not Vanessa, informing him, with the careful, apologetic tone of people delivering very bad news to a customer they still hoped to keep, that all 4 checks had been returned by the bank, marked NSF, drawn on a closed account. Daniel called Eleanor in a panic that same afternoon, his voice cracking in a way she hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Mom, there's something wrong. The bank's saying your account's closed, but Vanessa wrote checks off it. She said you told her it was fine. She said—" "I never told Vanessa any such thing," Eleanor said calmly, sitting at her own kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, the one hidden for months inside the hollowed-out cookbook. "Daniel, I need you to slow down and tell me exactly what your wife told you." What Vanessa had told him, it turned out, was a story that shifted its shape depending on who she told it to. To Daniel, at first, she claimed his mother had given her permission weeks earlier, in a phone call nobody else had heard, to use the checkbook for the down payment as a gift toward the truck. When Daniel pointed out that Eleanor was saying no such conversation ever happened, Vanessa's story shifted. She said she must have misunderstood a comment Eleanor made in passing, an easy, honest mistake anyone could make. When the dealership's finance manager mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the account had apparently been closed for months, not days, Vanessa's story shifted again, this time landing on something closer to outright accusation. "She probably closed it out of spite," Vanessa told Daniel, according to what he later, tearfully, repeated back to his mother over the phone. "You know how she gets. She's been funny about money ever since your dad died. Maybe she's losing it a little, Daniel. I don't know how to say this gently, but maybe we need to think about that." Eleanor sat very still when Daniel repeated those words to her, her grip tightening slightly on the phone, her eyes drifting to the window where she could see, 2 doors down, the porch light glowing at Walter's house. She thought about the 11 months of small, stolen charges, tested carefully to see if anyone would notice. She thought about the careful, forged signature on 4 separate checks. And now she was hearing that Vanessa's next move, faced with the consequences of her own choices, was to suggest that Eleanor, 71 years old, sharp as ever, meticulous enough to have caught every discrepancy in a bank statement most people would skim past, was losing her mind. It happens at your age, Eleanor thought, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something colder than grief settle behind her ribs, something closer to resolve. "Daniel," Eleanor said, very calmly into the phone, "I am going to need you to come to the house Monday morning. Just you. And I am going to need you to bring nothing but yourself and your willingness to listen. Because there are things about the last year I have not told you, and it's time you knew all of them." Daniel had gone quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded very young. "Mom, is this bad?" Eleanor closed her notebook gently, her hand resting flat against its cover the way it once rested against Frank's dining table full of evidence, all those months before. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm afraid it's about to be very bad indeed. But not for you. And not, I think, for much longer for me." She did not tell him, in that moment, just how thoroughly the trap she'd built was about to close. That would have to wait until she had every piece in place, until Walter and Ms. Alvarez and Detective Renner had all confirmed exactly what came next. But sitting there at her kitchen table that evening, watching the porch light glow steady 2 doors down, Eleanor Whitfield allowed herself, for the first time in 11 months, to feel something like hope. Daniel arrived at 10 on Monday morning, looking like a man who had not slept, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands shaking faintly around the coffee cup Eleanor pressed into them the moment he walked through the door. Eleanor sat him down at the same kitchen table where, months earlier, she had first spread out a year of bank statements and felt her whole understanding of her family quietly rearrange itself. She did not ease into it. She had decided the night before that gentleness had cost her enough already. 14 months ago, Eleanor began, I started noticing small charges on my account that I hadn't made. $40 here, $60 there. I mentioned it to Vanessa once, thinking perhaps she'd borrowed my card for an errand. Do you know what she told me? Daniel shook his head slowly, his jaw tightening. She told me I was imagining things, that it happens at my age. Eleanor's voice stayed level, almost gentle, even as she said it. I believed her, Daniel. For a little while, I genuinely believed her, because I love you, and loving you meant wanting to trust the woman you married. But the charges kept coming, bigger each time. 14 of them over 11 months, totaling just over $2,000. She slid the notebook across the table to him, opened to the first carefully documented page, dates and amounts in her own neat handwriting, each one cross-referenced against the bank statements Ms. Alvarez had helped her organize into a folder thick enough that Daniel visibly flinched when she set it down beside the notebook. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, This is $2,000 before the truck stuff." "Before the truck," Eleanor agreed quietly. "I didn't confront her, Daniel, because I know your wife, sweetheart, better than I think either of you realize, that confronting her without proof would only end with her making me look confused, and you caught in the middle, forced to choose between believing your mother or believing your wife. I did not want to put you in that position based on my word alone." Daniel's hands were pressed flat against the table now, his knuckles pale. "So, what did you do instead?" This was the part Eleanor had rehearsed in her mind more times than she could count, lying awake in the dark, waiting for a floorboard to creak. She reached across the table and took her son's hand, the way she used to when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "I closed the account," she said gently. "Months ago. I moved everything I had into a new account, somewhere Vanessa would never think to look, and I left the old checkbook exactly where it had always been, in my nightstand, untouched." Daniel stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment, and then understanding began to dawn across his face in slow, terrible waves. You left it there on purpose." "I left it there," Eleanor said softly, "because I needed proof that even you could not argue with, sweetheart. I am so sorry it had to be this way. I never wanted to trap anyone. I only wanted the truth to finally have nowhere left to hide." Daniel put his head down on the table for a long moment, his shoulders shaking, and Eleanor sat quietly beside him, one hand resting on his back, giving him the space to feel whatever he needed to feel. She had spent 2 years watching her gentle boy shrink under the weight of a marriage that asked more of him than it ever gave back. And some part of her had known, even before this moment, that eventually the truth would land on him like this, all at once, undeniable and devastating. "She said you were losing it," Daniel finally said, lifting his head, his eyes wet. "She told me that, Mom, to my face. She said maybe we needed to think about you losing it." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I heard." "How could she—" Daniel stopped himself, pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. $14,000, Mom, on a dead account. She knew. She had to have known. Eleanor did not answer right away. She let her son sit with the question, because some questions are not meant to be answered by anyone but the person asking them. And she had learned, over 2 years of grief and 2 years more of quiet vigilance, that silence sometimes did more good than any word she might have chosen. "There were things," Daniel said finally, his voice rough, staring down at his own hands as though he might find some answer written there. "Little things, Mom. Over the years, I kept telling myself they didn't mean anything." "Tell me," Eleanor said softly. Daniel exhaled, a long, shaking breath, and began, slowly, the way a person begins pulling threads from a sweater they already know is about to unravel entirely. "She has a credit card I've never seen a statement for. Whenever I asked about it, she'd say it was for her business expenses, the social media consulting, that it was easier to keep it separate for tax purposes. I never pushed. I figured that was normal, people keeping business and personal finances apart." He shook his head slowly. "Last year, our joint account ran short right before Christmas. $2,000 short, almost exactly. She told me it was because the SUV lease had an early termination fee she hadn't budgeted for. I believed her. I didn't check. Why would I check? She's my wife." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest at that number. $2,000. Almost exactly the amount she herself had documented stolen from her own account over the same stretch of months. She said nothing yet, only listened, letting Daniel find his own way toward the shape of what he was beginning to understand. "And there was a weekend, maybe 8 months ago," Daniel continued, his voice growing quieter, "when she told me she was going to visit her sister in Columbus. She was gone 2 nights. When she came back, she had a new handbag, something expensive, and when I asked how her sister was doing, she got this look on her face. Just for a second, Mom, this flicker. And then she said, 'Fine, same as always,' and changed the subject so fast I didn't think anything of it at the time." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes again. "I called her sister myself once, months later, about something unrelated, a birthday, and her sister mentioned she hadn't seen Vanessa since the wedding. Since our wedding, Mom! That was 8 years ago. Eleanor reached over and took her son's hand again, feeling the tremor still running through it. Where do you think she was, Daniel? I don't know, he said, and his voice cracked wide open on the last word. I don't know, and I think that's the part that scares me most. I've spent 8 years assuming the worst thing about my own marriage was that my wife could be a little cold sometimes, a little sharp with people, especially with you. I never once let myself imagine she might be lying to me about actual, concrete things. Weekends, money, where she was standing on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching her son's face, seeing in it the particular anguish of a person forced to recalculate an entire decade of memory all at once, searching backward through years of ordinary moments for the seams where the lies had been sewn in. She remembered doing exactly the same thing herself, months earlier, sitting at this same table with a year of bank statements spread in front of her, feeling her whole understanding of her family quietly rearrange itself piece by piece. I am not going to pretend I know where she was those 2 nights, Eleanor said carefully. That is not my story to tell you, and it may be one you need to ask her directly when the time comes, though I understand if you're not ready for that conversation today. But Daniel, I want you to hear something clearly, because I think it matters more than any single detail we could piece together this morning. A person capable of forging a signature to take $14,000 from a woman who has never once been anything but kind to her is a person capable of a great many other things she has simply not yet been caught doing. Daniel flinched, visibly, as though the words had physical weight. You think there's more? I think, Eleanor said gently, that we are only seeing the parts of the iceberg that happened to break the surface. The account I closed, the charges I happened to notice. I am not telling you this to hurt you further, sweetheart. I am telling you because I need you to stop assuming, the way you have for 8 years, that the version of events you're given is automatically the true one. Daniel sat with that, his jaw working, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Outside, a car passed slowly down Larkspur Lane, its engine fading into the ordinary quiet of a Monday morning. The kind of quiet that existed on this street every single day, regardless of what was falling apart inside any particular kitchen along it. How did you even find out about the checks? Daniel finally asked, his voice steadier now, moving from grief toward something closer to the need for facts, for solid ground beneath a floor that had just given way entirely. The dealership called me. Did they call you too? Mr. Doyle called me first, Eleanor said. The branch manager I've worked with since I closed the account. He'd flagged it specifically, at my request, so that any activity would come to me directly rather than sitting in a queue somewhere. He called me Friday afternoon, right around the same time the dealership was calling you, and told me 4 checks had come through against the closed account, all in the same week, totaling $14,000. Friday, Daniel repeated slowly. That's 3 days ago, Mom. You've known for 3 days. I have, Eleanor admitted. I needed that time, Daniel. I needed to speak with Ms. Alvarez and with Detective Renner, and to make certain everything was documented correctly before I sat down with you. Because I understood that once I told you, there would be no going back to the family we were before this Monday. I wanted to give you the whole truth, all at once, clearly, rather than pieces of it scattered across a week of confused phone calls. Daniel nodded slowly, though Eleanor could see the effort it took him. The way a person nods when they are still absorbing something too large to fully hold yet. "The detective," he said. "You said his name. Detective Renner. He's already involved?" "He is," Eleanor said. The dealership reported the bounced checks to their bank as soon as they were flagged as drawn on a closed account. And given the amount involved, that triggered an automatic referral to the fraud unit. Ms. Alvarez has been in contact with him since Friday, making certain my documentation, everything I gathered over the past year, is properly filed alongside the dealership's report. So this isn't something we can just handle quietly, as a family. Daniel's voice carried a note of desperate hope on that last part. The hope of a man who still, even now, wanted badly to believe there was some version of this where the people he loved most did not have to watch each other's worlds collapse in a courtroom. Eleanor felt her heart ache at the sound of it, because she remembered wanting exactly that kind of quiet resolution herself, months earlier, before she understood that quiet resolutions were precisely what Vanessa had been counting on all along. "I wish I could tell you it could be handled quietly, sweetheart. I do. But writing 4 checks against an account you know to be closed, using a signature you know is not your own, in order to obtain $14,000 in goods? That is not a misunderstanding a family dinner can smooth over. That is a felony, Daniel, whether it happened inside this family or between 2 strangers. The law does not draw a softer line for daughters-in-law." Daniel put his head in his hands again, and this time, when his shoulders shook, no sound came out at all, just the silent, wrenching effort of a grown man trying to hold himself together in his mother's kitchen, the way he must have tried 1,000 smaller times over the past 8 years, to hold together a marriage that had apparently been quietly hollowing itself out from the inside the entire time. Eleanor let him have that moment, sitting beside him with one hand resting steady on his back, the way she had when he was small and the thunderstorms outside his childhood window had felt like the end of the world. She thought of Frank and what he would have said, watching their son come apart at this same table. She thought of Lily, asleep, blessedly unaware, in the very bedroom that had once been Daniel's own. And she thought, with a clarity that felt almost like a physical weight settling into her chest, that whatever came next, the interviews, the charges, the courtroom, the slow and painful reassembly of a family that would never again look quite the way it had before that Monday morning, she was prepared to carry every bit of it, for both of their sakes, because someone in this family needed to be steady enough to hold the rest of them together while the truth finished doing its work. "Mom," Daniel said finally, lifting his head, his voice raw but no longer shaking. "I need you to tell me the rest of it. All of it. Don't soften anything for me. I've had 8 years of things being softened for me, and look where that got us." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, choosing her next words carefully, because what she said next would determine how the rest of this played out. Whether Daniel walked out of this kitchen ready to protect his wife out of habit, or ready, finally, to see clearly. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that your wife has spent a long time believing that the people around her exist to make her life easier, and that the consequences of her choices are things other people absorb on her behalf. I think she believed I would absorb this too. Quietly. The way I've absorbed a great deal over the years for the sake of peace in this family." Daniel flinched at that, and Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. "I am done absorbing things, Daniel. Not because I don't love you. Because I love Lily too much to teach her, by my own example, that a woman is supposed to swallow whatever is done to her and call it keeping the peace." Daniel sat with that for a long time, staring down at the folder of bank statements between them. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, steadier, older somehow, as though something in him had finally, painfully grown up. What happens now? Eleanor reached over and closed the folder gently, the way a person closes a door on a room they don't intend to walk back into. Now, she said quietly, we let the truth do what truth does. But Daniel, I need you to understand something before this goes any further. This isn't just going to be an uncomfortable conversation at dinner anymore. Writing checks on a closed account, knowing it's closed, isn't a mistake the family quietly forgives. It's a felony. Detective Renner has already been in contact with Ms. Alvarez. This is moving forward whether any of us feel ready for it or not. Daniel's face went pale. She could be arrested. She could, Eleanor said softly, and there was no triumph in her voice at all, only a tired, sorrowful honesty. And Daniel, I need you to know that I take no joy in that, none. But I will not lie to protect her from the consequences of what she chose to do to me. And I need you to decide, right now, at this table, whether you're prepared to stand where the truth is, even when it's hard. Because Lily is watching both of us, whether we realize it or not, and she deserves parents who don't teach her that lying is simply what people do when the truth is inconvenient. Daniel did not answer right away. He sat in his mother's kitchen, in the house he'd grown up in, staring at his own hands, and Eleanor let him take all the time he needed, because some decisions cannot be rushed, and this, she knew, was the most important one her son had ever faced. She had no idea, watching him sit there in silence, just how much harder the coming weeks were about to be for all of them, or how completely Vanessa's whole carefully constructed world was about to fall apart in front of witnesses. The weeks that followed unfolded with the strange, suspended quality of a held breath. Eleanor spent them doing what she had always done best, preparing, quietly, thoroughly, without fanfare. She met twice more with Ms. Alvarez, who walked her through exactly what a criminal fraud complaint would involve, and once with Detective Renner himself, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with a folder already thickening with documentation from First Heritage Bank's fraud division, who explained, gently but plainly, that the dealership's finance office had already flagged the 4 bounced checks and forwarded copies of each one, complete with the signature Vanessa had so carefully practiced. "The signatures are close," Detective Renner told Eleanor, sliding photocopies across a table in a small municipal office that smelled faintly of stale coffee. "But they're not exact. Forensic document examiners can spot the difference almost immediately. The pressure points are wrong. The natural hesitations in your genuine signature aren't there in hers. Combined with the account closure date, the dealership's statement identifying her by name and appearance, and your own documentation of the pattern going back over a year, Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you. This is about as strong a case as I've seen in this line of work." "What happens next?" Eleanor asked. "We'll want to interview her formally. Given the amount involved, $14,000 on the truck checks alone, plus the pattern of smaller unauthorized charges going back further, we're looking at a felony charge for uttering a forged instrument, potentially combined with a separate charge for the earlier thefts, depending on how the DA's office wants to structure it. She'll likely be offered the chance to make restitution as part of any plea arrangement. But Mrs. Whitfield, I want you prepared. This is not going to stay quiet. Dealerships talk. Small towns talk." Eleanor had nodded slowly, thinking not of herself, but of Lily, of the small, sturdy girl who called her Grandma Elle and believed, with the uncomplicated faith of an 8-year-old, that both the women in her life loved her equally and would always tell her the truth. "Detective," Eleanor said quietly, "is there any way to handle this that spares my granddaughter as much of this as possible?" Detective Renner's expression softened. "We'll do what we can, ma'am, but I won't lie to you and tell you this won't touch her at all. It will. What matters most, in my experience, is what the adults around her do next. Whether they handle it with honesty and care, or whether they try to hide her from a truth she's going to sense anyway. Eleanor carried that advice with her for the rest of that week, turning it over and over, until it settled into something like a guiding principle. She would not hide the truth from Lily. She would simply make sure that whatever the girl eventually learned, she learned it surrounded by people who loved her steadily enough to make the truth survivable. Meanwhile, Daniel had moved out of the house he shared with Vanessa. Not permanently, not yet, he told his mother carefully. But he needed space to think, and Lily needed one home that felt calm while the rest of the family sorted through the wreckage. He and Lily stayed in Eleanor's spare room, the same room that had once been his own childhood bedroom, and Eleanor found herself in the strange, aching middle of all this upheaval, waking each morning to the sound of her granddaughter's small feet padding down the hallway toward the kitchen, asking, in the same solemn voice every single day, whether there might be pancakes. There were always pancakes. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to sense the walls closing in around her long before the formal interview was even scheduled. She called Eleanor twice that week, voicemails Eleanor listened to once and then saved carefully, at Ms. Alvarez's instruction, as additional evidence of Vanessa's shifting, increasingly desperate story. The first voicemail was conciliatory, almost sweet, a tone Eleanor had rarely heard Vanessa use with her in 8 years. "Eleanor, hi. It's Vanessa. Listen, I think there's just been a huge misunderstanding here, and I really think if we all just sat down together as a family, we could work this out without it going any further, you know? I love Daniel. I love Lily. I don't want this to blow up into something none of us can take back." The second voicemail, left 3 days later after Daniel confirmed he'd spoken with a lawyer of his own, carried a very different tone. "Eleanor, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but you are destroying this family over a misunderstanding. And if you actually go through with pressing charges against the mother of your own granddaughter, I hope you understand exactly what that's going to do to Lily. Because that's on you, not me." Eleanor had sat very still after listening to that second message, feeling the old, familiar flare of guilt rise up in her chest. The same guilt Vanessa had been quietly weaponizing against her for 8 years. The implication that any consequence Vanessa faced was somehow Eleanor's fault for insisting on accountability in the first place. But then, Eleanor thought of the floorboard creaking at 4 in the morning. She thought of the careful, practiced forgery on 4 checks totaling $14,000. She thought of Vanessa telling Daniel that his own mother might be losing her mind, simply because the truth had become inconvenient. And the guilt, which had once been so effective a tool against her, simply did not take hold this time. "She's not sorry she did it," Eleanor said quietly to Walter, sitting on her porch that evening as the sun dipped low behind the oak trees Frank had planted the year Daniel was born. "She's sorry she got caught." Walter nodded slowly, pouring them both a fresh cup of coffee from the same thermos he'd been bringing over every Thursday for 2 years now. "That's usually how it goes, Eleanor. People like that don't feel remorse for the harm. They feel inconvenienced by the consequences." Eleanor sipped her coffee and looked out at the quiet street, thinking of everything still ahead of her. The formal interview, the likely charges, the family gathering Ms. Alvarez had gently suggested might become necessary. A moment where everything would need to be said plainly, in front of everyone, so there could be no more shifting stories, no more whispered accusations that Eleanor was simply an old woman losing her grip on reality. She did not yet know that moment would come sooner than she expected, or that it would happen in front of far more witnesses than she'd ever anticipated. The moment arrived, as these things so often do, at a family gathering nobody had originally intended to become a reckoning. It was Daniel's 39th birthday, 3 weeks after that first 4 in the morning creak, and Eleanor had planned, months earlier, before any of this began, to host a small dinner at her house. Nothing extravagant, just family, the way birthdays had always been celebrated on Larkspur Lane. Given everything unfolding, she had nearly canceled it. But Ms. Alvarez, in one of their final preparation meetings, had made a suggestion that struck Eleanor as both frightening and somehow exactly right. "Vanessa still doesn't fully understand how much evidence you actually have," Ms. Alvarez said. "She's been telling anyone who'll listen that this is all a misunderstanding, that you're confused, that you're vindictive. If there's a setting where the whole family is already gathered, where the truth can be laid out plainly, in front of the people whose opinions matter most to her, Daniel, Karen, Lily eventually understanding it in an age-appropriate way, that tends to be far more effective than a quiet phone call nobody else witnesses. People like Vanessa depend on controlling the narrative in private. Take away the privacy, and the narrative usually collapses on its own." Eleanor had thought of Frank then, and the way he used to say that the truth, given enough room to stand, rarely needed anyone's help to be believed. She carried that thought with her through the days that followed, turning it over the way she once turned over a difficult verse of scripture, looking for the shape of comfort hidden inside it. The truth, given enough room to stand, rarely needed anyone's help to be believed. She wanted, badly, to trust that completely. But Eleanor had also learned over the preceding months that room had to be built before truth could stand in it, and building a room strong enough to hold a woman like Vanessa required more than good intentions. She met with Ms. Alvarez twice more that week, in the small office that smelled of stale coffee and old carpet, going over exactly what could and could not be said at a family gathering without compromising the case Detective Renner was still quietly assembling. "You are legally allowed to tell your own family the truth about your own finances," Ms. Alvarez reminded her, tapping a pen against a legal pad covered in careful notes. "That is not entrapment, Eleanor, and it is not interference with an investigation. What you cannot do is coach anyone on what to say if the detective interviews them, and you cannot destroy or alter any of the documentation we've already filed. Beyond that, you are simply a woman telling the truth at her son's birthday dinner. There is nothing improper about that." "And if she denies it," Eleanor asked, "in front of everyone, if she looks me in the eye and calls me a liar?" Ms. Alvarez had smiled then, a small, knowing smile that reminded Eleanor, oddly, of Frank on the evenings he'd catch a supplier trying to shortchange him on a shipment count. "Then you show her the checks, Eleanor. You have photocopies. You have the bank's documentation. You have 14 months of your own careful notes. Denial only works on people who don't have proof in front of them. You do." Eleanor had nodded slowly, feeling something settle into place inside her chest, a kind of readiness she recognized from watching Frank prepare for difficult conversations with vendors decades before. Not eagerness, exactly, but the calm, grounded certainty of a person who had done the work and no longer needed to fear the outcome. Detective Renner called her separately that same week, his voice as unhurried and steady as it always was. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Whitfield," he said. A family confrontation like the one you're describing won't hurt our case, and it may actually help it if witnesses hear her respond in the moment before she's had time to rehearse a story with an attorney present. But I want you prepared for the fact that people who are cornered sometimes say things they wouldn't say otherwise, in either direction. She may confess something in front of everyone. She may also become combative, or say something designed to hurt you as deeply as possible, simply because she has nowhere else left to aim. I understand, Eleanor said quietly. I've had a great deal of practice absorbing things she's aimed at me over the years, Detective. I don't imagine one more evening will undo me. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Detective Renner said in a tone that carried more warmth than his usual careful professionalism. For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitfield, in 22 years doing this job, I don't think I've ever seen a case built this cleanly by someone outside of law enforcement. Whatever happens Saturday night, you should know that. Eleanor had thanked him, quietly, and hung up the phone feeling something she hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this. A small, private flicker of pride, not in what she was about to do to Vanessa, but in what she had managed to build, brick by careful brick, out of 11 months of stolen $40 charges and a single sleepless night listening to a floorboard creak. Daniel came by twice that week as well, each visit a little steadier than the one before. He had moved forward in his own halting way with the process of separating his finances from Vanessa's entirely, working with an attorney of his own now, a colleague of Ms. Alvarez's named Robert Chen, who specialized in family law and had, according to Daniel, looked distinctly unsurprised by most of what he'd been told. He said this is more common than people think, Daniel told Eleanor, sitting at her kitchen table on Thursday evening while Lily colored quietly at the counter nearby. Financial deception in marriages. He said sometimes it's affairs, sometimes it's gambling, sometimes it's just somebody who can't stop spending and doesn't know how to tell the truth about it. He said the pattern is almost always the same. Small lies first, then bigger ones once the small ones work. Does that help? Eleanor asked gently. Knowing it's a pattern? Knowing you're not the only one this has happened to? Daniel considered the question for a long moment, watching Lily press a green crayon carefully inside the lines of a drawing of their old dog, gone now 11 years but still, apparently, vivid enough in family photographs that Lily insisted on drawing him from memory. A little, he admitted finally. It makes me feel less like an idiot, at least. Like maybe I wasn't uniquely blind, just ordinarily trusting, and she was ordinarily good at exploiting that. You are not an idiot, Eleanor said firmly. You are a man who believed the promise he made at his own wedding meant something, and built a life around that belief. That is not foolishness, Daniel. That is decency. It only becomes a problem when the person on the other side of that promise doesn't share it. He'd reached across the table then and taken her hand, the same gesture she'd offered him so many times over the preceding weeks, and Eleanor felt, in that small exchange, the quiet beginning of something mending between them. Not repaired yet, not fully, but no longer actively breaking either. Karen's flight landed on Friday evening, and she came straight to Larkspur Lane from the airport, dropping her suitcase in the front hall and pulling Eleanor into a fierce, unhurried hug that lasted long enough for both of them to feel the full weight of everything unsaid over months of careful phone calls. You look tired, Mom, Karen said, pulling back to study her mother's face with the same sharp, assessing eyes she'd had since childhood. I am tired, Eleanor admitted. But I am also ready. There's a difference, sweetheart. That evening, the three of them, Eleanor, Karen, and Daniel, with Lily already tucked into bed down the hall, sat around the same kitchen table where so much of this had already unfolded, and Eleanor walked her children through exactly what she intended to say the following evening, and exactly why. She did not want either of them blindsided. She wanted them prepared, steady, and united, the way Frank had always insisted a family needed to be before walking into any difficult reckoning together. "I still don't fully understand why you're doing this at the birthday dinner," Karen said, turning her water glass slowly on the table. "Why not just let the legal process happen quietly, Mom? Why put yourself through a scene?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, because it was one she had asked herself many times over the preceding week. "Because for 8 years," she said slowly, "Vanessa has controlled every story that gets told about our family, in every room she's ever stood in. She decided I was confused. She decided I was imagining things. She decided, when the checks bounced, that I was vindictive and spiteful and losing my grip. She has never once had to answer for any of it in front of the people whose good opinion she actually values, because she's always managed to get to each of us privately, one at a time, and shape the story before we could compare notes." She paused, folding her hands on the table the way she so often did when she needed a moment to steady herself before continuing. "Tomorrow, for the first time, she is going to have to answer for what she did in front of everyone at once. No private phone calls, no separate conversations where she can tailor the story to whoever's listening. Just the truth, laid out plainly, with all of us hearing it together. I think she has earned that kind of reckoning, and I think, more importantly, that Lily's father and aunt deserve to watch me hold my ground, so that when Lily is old enough to ask questions about what happened, they can tell her honestly that her grandmother did not hide from it." Karen's eyes had filled at that, and she reached across the table to take her mother's hand, the same gesture that seemed to be passing quietly between all three of them these days, a small, wordless language of steadiness they were only now, in the wreckage of the past year, learning to speak fluently with one another. "All right," Karen said finally, her voice thick. "Tell me what you need from me tomorrow." "I need you to sit beside me," Eleanor said simply. "That's all. I need you to be a witness who has no reason to protect her and no history of looking away. You've never needed convincing about who Vanessa is, Karen. That matters more than you know." The following morning, Eleanor stood in front of her closet for longer than she had in years, looking past the soft, familiar cardigans and modest floral blouses she usually reached for, until her hand finally settled on a simple charcoal dress she had bought for Frank's memorial service 2 years earlier and had not worn since. She held it up to the light for a long moment, studying the clean, unfussy lines of it, and felt something settle into place, the way a decision settles once it has finally been made all the way through. She was not dressing for Vanessa's benefit. She understood that clearly, standing there. She was dressing for her own, a quiet, private way of telling herself that whatever happened at that table that evening, she intended to meet it as exactly who she was, without apology, without shrinking, without the soft, forgettable colors she had worn for so many years to avoid taking up too much space in rooms that had never quite made room for her. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the roast was in the oven, the table was set with Frank's mother's good china, and Walter had arrived early, as promised, settling into the armchair by the window with the quiet, steady presence of a man who understood exactly what his role would be that evening. Not to speak unless asked, but simply to be there, an anchor in the room for a woman who had spent months building toward this single, unavoidable evening. Eleanor stood in her kitchen in the charcoal dress, checking the roast one final time, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it to matter. So the birthday dinner went forward as planned, on a warm Saturday evening, with Karen flying in from Denver specifically for the occasion, something she had not originally planned to do, until Eleanor called her 3 days earlier and said, simply, "I think you should be here for this one, sweetheart." Vanessa arrived at 6:30, dressed carefully, her makeup flawless, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that Eleanor recognized instantly as armor. She had clearly decided, in the days since her two very different voicemails, that her best strategy was a full return to normalcy, as though enough confidence, worn convincingly enough, might simply will the entire situation back into the shape of a misunderstanding. "Eleanor," Vanessa said warmly, kissing the air near Eleanor's cheek in the doorway. "The house looks lovely. I really am glad we're all doing this together, as a family. I think we all need this." "So do I," Eleanor said pleasantly, and stepped aside to let her in. Dinner proceeded, at first, with the strained, brittle politeness of people carefully avoiding the one topic filling every silence in the room. Lily chattered happily about a school art project. Karen and Daniel exchanged careful, loaded glances across the table. Vanessa complimented the roast, poured herself a second glass of wine, and laughed a little too brightly at every small joke. Eleanor waited until the plates had been cleared, until Lily had wandered into the living room to watch cartoons, safely out of earshot, and until Walter, invited, quietly at Eleanor's request, both as a family friend and as a steady presence who understood exactly what was coming, had settled into the chair beside her. Then she set down her coffee cup, folded her hands on the table, and said, in a voice that was calm and level and carried, somehow, the full weight of everything that had led to this moment, "Vanessa, I think it's time we talked honestly about the checkbook." The table went silent. Vanessa's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "Eleanor," Vanessa said, setting the glass down with a careful, controlled smile. "I really don't think tonight is the—" "I disagree," Eleanor said quietly, cutting her off with a gentleness that somehow made the interruption land harder than any raised voice could have. "I think tonight is exactly the right time, because everyone at this table has heard a different version of this story from you over the last 3 weeks, and I think everyone deserves to hear the same version at the same time with the truth in front of them." "This is unbelievable," Vanessa said, her voice rising slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. "You're really doing this? At Daniel's birthday? In front of Karen? This is exactly the kind of dramatic, controlling thing I've been telling Daniel about for years, and now everyone can finally see it for themselves." Eleanor did not flinch. She reached down to the seat beside her, where a manila folder had been sitting, unremarked upon since before dinner began, and set it gently on the table. 14 months ago, Eleanor began, her voice steady, "I began noticing unauthorized charges on my checking account, small ones at first. I brought it to Vanessa's attention directly, and she told me, and I quote because I wrote it down that same evening, 'You're imagining things again, Eleanor. It happens at your age.'" She opened the folder and slid the first page across the table toward Karen, who picked it up with visibly shaking hands. Over the following 11 months, 14 additional unauthorized charges appeared, totaling $2,160. Every single one occurred at locations along routes Vanessa regularly traveled. Eleanor's voice did not rise. It did not need to. I did not confront her again because I understood by then that I would need proof strong enough that no one could dismiss it as an old woman's confusion. "This is insane," Vanessa said, her voice cracking now, all trace of her earlier composure gone. "Daniel, are you seriously going to sit there and let her—" "Let me finish," Eleanor said, and something in her tone, quiet, unhurried, absolutely unshakable, made even Vanessa fall silent. "So I closed the account, months ago. I moved every dollar I had into a new account, and I left the old checkbook exactly where it had always been, in my nightstand, knowing that anyone who took it without asking would be writing checks on money that no longer existed." Eleanor reached back into the folder and produced 4 photocopied checks, laying them out one by one on the table like a hand of cards finally revealed. 4 checks, $14,000, written to a truck dealership over the course of 1 week. Every single one signed in a hand attempting to imitate mine. Every single one drawn against an account that had not held a single dollar in over 4 months. The silence that followed was the kind Eleanor had imagined, in the quiet hours of the night, more times than she could count. Heavy, absolute, broken only by the faint sound of cartoon music drifting in from the living room where Lily sat, blessedly unaware, still safely on the other side of this reckoning. Vanessa's face had gone very pale. Daniel, you told me the account was fine. You said your mom— I never said any such thing, Daniel said quietly, and his voice, though soft, carried a finality that seemed to land on Vanessa harder than any shout could have. I never told you that, Vanessa. Stop saying I did. Then it was a mistake, Vanessa said, her voice climbing toward hysteria now, her hands trembling as she reached for her wine glass and then seemed to think better of it. I made a mistake. I didn't know it was closed. How was I supposed to know? The bank statement flagging your closure would have arrived at this house, Eleanor said gently, if I had not specifically redirected it. You did not simply write a check on an account you believed was active, Vanessa. You crept into my bedroom at 4 o'clock in the morning while I was asleep, and you took a checkbook from my nightstand without asking because you already knew, somewhere in yourself, that if you had asked, I would have said no. The room had grown silent. The room had gone utterly still. Karen sat frozen, the photocopied statement still clutched in her hand. Walter sat quiet and steady beside Eleanor, a silent witness to everything he had helped set in motion months before. And Daniel, gentle, easily led Daniel, who had spent 8 years learning to look away from things that were inconvenient, sat with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on his wife, seeing her, perhaps for the very first time, with absolute clarity. Vanessa's eyes darted around the table, searching for an ally, for anyone who might still be willing to soften this for her, and finding none. Some of us actually contribute, Eleanor, she finally spat, her voice shaking with something between fury and panic, reaching, in her desperation, for the same cutting phrase she had thrown at Eleanor a dozen times over the years, at a dozen dinners just like this one. You've never had to work for anything, sitting in this house Frank left you, judging the rest of us for actually trying to build a life. Eleanor let the words settle in the air for a moment, unhurried, before she answered, her voice quiet, level, and absolutely unshaken. Some of us actually contribute, Vanessa, she repeated softly, and something in the stillness of her tone made even Karen go rigid in her chair. I contributed the evidence. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond and found, for what may have been the first time in 8 years, that she had nothing left to say. It was in that exact silence, into the raw, ringing quiet left behind by Eleanor's words, that a phone buzzed against the table. Detective Renner's name lit up the screen of Eleanor's own cell phone, right on schedule, exactly as Ms. Alvarez had arranged 3 days earlier, and Eleanor looked up, calm and steady, and said quietly, "That will be the detective, confirming your interview for Monday morning, Vanessa. I do hope you'll be honest with him. It tends to go better for everyone that way." Vanessa's face, already pale, drained to something closer to gray, and for the first time all evening, she said absolutely nothing at all. Nobody in that dining room yet understood just how quickly the rest of Vanessa's carefully built life was about to come apart around her, or how little of it would still be standing by the time the truth was finished with her. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, and Vanessa sat across from Detective Renner in a small interview room at the municipal building, no longer able to shift her story from one listener to another, because for the first time, every relevant listener, Daniel, Karen, Eleanor, Ms. Alvarez, and now the detective himself, was working from the exact same set of facts. Eleanor did not attend the interview itself, though Ms. Alvarez briefed her afterward on the broad strokes. Vanessa had reportedly tried, at first, to maintain that she genuinely believed the account was still active, that she'd simply misunderstood something Daniel had said months earlier about his mother wanting to help with the truck. But Detective Renner, methodical and unhurried, had laid out the timeline piece by piece. The account closure date, 4 full months before the checks were written. The specific redirection of all bank correspondence away from the shared household. The dealership employee's statement confirming Vanessa had introduced herself by name and explicitly told them Eleanor wasn't comfortable driving out this far anymore, a detail that made clear she understood full well whose signature she was forging and why she needed a cover story for its absence. Faced with the accumulated weight of it, Vanessa's composure had reportedly cracked entirely partway through the interview. She had cried. She had, according to Ms. Alvarez's careful, measured retelling, alternated between tearful apologies and flashes of the same old defensiveness, insisting at one point that she'd always intended to pay it back eventually, a claim that meant little against 4 forged signatures and a documented pattern stretching back nearly a year. By Wednesday, the district attorney's office had formally filed charges. 1 count of uttering a forged instrument for the 4 truck-related checks, and a separate count covering the pattern of smaller unauthorized transactions dating back 14 months. Ms. Alvarez explained to Eleanor that, given the amount involved and Vanessa's lack of any prior criminal record, a plea arrangement was likely, one that would almost certainly involve full restitution of the $2,160 in earlier thefts, along with formal responsibility for the $14,000 from the truck checks, a probationary period, and a permanent criminal record that would follow Vanessa for the rest of her life. She'll likely avoid jail time, Ms. Alvarez told Eleanor gently, in what had become their final scheduled meeting. First offense, full amount involved, cooperation with restitution. Judges tend to favor probation and repayment over incarceration in cases like this, especially with a young child in the picture. But Eleanor, I want you to understand what this conviction means for her going forward. A felony fraud conviction follows a person. It shows up on background checks. It closes doors. Certain jobs, certain licenses, even something as simple as renting a new apartment can become complicated. This isn't a slap on the wrist. This is going to reshape the rest of her life. Eleanor absorbed that quietly, feeling, even then, an unexpected flicker of something like sorrow mixed in with the relief. She had not built this trap out of hatred. She had built it because she had run out of other ways to be believed. I don't feel like celebrating, if I'm honest, Eleanor admitted to Walter that same evening, sitting on her porch as the last of the daylight faded gold over the oak trees. I keep thinking about Lily, about what it means for a little girl to grow up knowing her mother did this. Walter was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Eleanor, I've watched a lot of families go through something like this over the years I did that job. And I'll tell you the thing I always came back to. The damage isn't caused by the truth coming out. The damage is caused by the lie continuing. Lily was always going to learn, eventually, one way or another, what kind of choices her mother was capable of making. Better she learns it now, at 8, surrounded by people who love her and are honest with her, than at 18 or 28, blindsided by it, wondering why nobody ever told her. Eleanor let that settle over her, the way she'd let so many hard truths settle over the past year, and found, slowly, that it eased something tight in her chest. She thought of Frank, and what he would have said, sitting in his old spot on this same porch, and she found she already knew. He would have told her she had done exactly right. Patience, given enough time, does its own quiet work. And the woman who apologized for existing at family dinners for 8 straight years, who had smiled politely through vintage comments and gift cards to closed stores and every accusation that she was simply imagining things, did not get up from that dining room table 3 weeks earlier as the same woman who had sat down at it. She had gotten up as someone who finally understood the full weight of her own quiet strength. Vanessa's plea hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Daniel filed for a legal separation, moved permanently into an apartment near Eleanor's house with Lily, and began the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust with a mother he had spent years accidentally, unintentionally failing to fully see. It would not be a quick or simple road for any of them, but for the first time in longer than Eleanor could easily remember, it was, at least, an honest one. What none of them yet knew was just how far Vanessa's collapse would ultimately reach, or how completely the family she had once dismissed so easily would come to stand together in its wake. The plea hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in late autumn, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood polish and rain-damp coats. Eleanor sat in the second row, between Karen and Walter, watching Vanessa stand beside her attorney in a plain gray suit that looked nothing like the designer wardrobe she had once flaunted so proudly at every family gathering. There was no dramatic confession, no tearful courtroom speech of the kind Eleanor might have imagined in an earlier, less exhausted season of her life. There was only the quiet, procedural weight of the legal system doing its careful work. A judge reading the charges aloud in a flat, unhurried voice. Vanessa's attorney entering a plea of guilty to both counts as part of the arrangement Ms. Alvarez had helped negotiate on Eleanor's behalf, and the judge outlining, in plain terms, the sentence that would follow. 3 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, full restitution of $2,160 to be repaid according to a structured schedule, a permanent felony record. Vanessa did not look back at the gallery once during the entire proceeding. Eleanor watched her shoulders, rigid and small beneath the unfamiliar gray suit, and felt no triumph at all, only a tired, complicated kind of sorrow. The sorrow of watching someone reap exactly what they had spent years quietly planting. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Vanessa approached Eleanor alone, her attorney trailing a few steps behind, giving them space. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa said, very quietly, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the polish and performance Eleanor had grown so used to over 8 years, "I never actually thought you'd go through with it." "I know," Eleanor said gently. "That was rather the problem, wasn't it?" Vanessa's eyes filled, and for the first time, Eleanor believed the tears were genuine, uncalculated, unwitnessed by anyone she might have wanted to perform for. "I'm going to lose everything. My job, once this shows up on a background check. Half my friends already won't return my calls. Daniel," her voice broke, "I don't even know if I get to see Lily the way I used to." Eleanor thought carefully before answering, because she understood, standing in that hallway, that whatever she said next would be the last real conversation these 2 women ever had. "You didn't lose those things because I told the truth, Vanessa," she said finally, quietly. "You lost them the moment you decided the truth didn't apply to you. I only made sure it caught up." Vanessa had no answer for that. She simply nodded, once, and walked away down the long courthouse hallway, and Eleanor watched her go without malice, without satisfaction, only a tired, aching relief that the long year of quiet vigilance had finally come to its end. 6 months later, the world Eleanor had rebuilt in the wreckage of that year looked nothing like the one Vanessa had once dismissed so easily as charming, very vintage. Daniel had moved through his separation with a slow, steady growth Eleanor found herself quietly proud of, week after week, attending co-parenting counseling, rebuilding a closer relationship with his sister Karen, and spending every single Sunday afternoon at his mother's kitchen table, the one Frank built with his own hands, teaching Lily how to bake the chocolate chip cookies she still insisted, at 9 years old now, were the best in America, maybe the world. Lily had adjusted better than any of them had dared hope, in the resilient, uncomplicated way children sometimes do when the adults around them handle hard truths with steadiness instead of chaos. She split her time between her father's apartment and occasional supervised visits with her mother, and though there were hard days, quiet questions asked at unexpected moments, Eleanor made certain the girl always knew, without a shadow of doubt, that she was safe and loved, and never, ever to blame for any of it. "Grandma Elle," Lily asked her one Sunday afternoon, flour dusting her small hands, "did you know Mom took your checkbook before it happened?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things these days, weighing honesty against gentleness and finding, as she so often did, that the two were not actually opposites. "I suspected someone might, sweetheart. I didn't know for certain it would be your mom, not until it happened. But I made sure that whatever happened, the truth would be easy to find. That's something very important I want you to remember, always. The truth doesn't need anyone's help staying hidden. It only needs someone brave enough to go looking for it." Lily had nodded, solemn in the way only children can manage, and gone back to pressing chocolate chips into cookie dough, and Eleanor had felt, watching her, a quiet and complete certainty that whatever else this year had cost her, it had not cost her this. The steady, unbroken thread connecting her to the person she loved most fiercely in all the world. Vanessa, for her part, had moved 2 towns over, into a small apartment Eleanor heard about only secondhand, through the careful, limited channels of court-supervised visitation logistics. She had lost her job at the marketing firm within a month of the conviction becoming public record, exactly as Ms. Alvarez had predicted. Eleanor heard, eventually, that she'd taken a position at a retail store, the kind of work Vanessa had once looked down her nose at during family dinners, back when she still believed her own comfort was owed to her rather than earned. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only a quiet, settled sense that the world, left alone long enough, tends to arrange itself according to the choices people actually make, rather than the image they try to project. As for Eleanor herself, she had, in the strange, unexpected aftermath of that terrible year, become something she had not been in a very long time. Not merely tolerated, not merely absorbed into the background of other people's lives, expected to smile and pass the mashed potatoes, and let small cruelties roll past her like rain. She had become, in her own quiet way, the undeniable center of her family's steadiness. Karen called every Sunday now, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, easy warmth. Daniel brought Lily by 3 times a week, sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table and talk, no occasion required. Walter still came by every Thursday with his thermos of coffee, and some evenings, Eleanor found herself laughing on that porch in a way she hadn't laughed freely since Frank was still alive to share the joke with her. One evening in early spring, nearly a year after that 4 a.m. creak had first pulled her from sleep, Eleanor sat on her porch with Walter, watching Lily chase fireflies across the front lawn, while Daniel looked on, laughing, calling out encouragement every time she nearly caught one. "You did something remarkable, you know," Walter said quietly, watching the same scene. "Most people, faced with what you were facing, either explode or collapse. You did neither. You waited. You built something solid, brick by brick, and you let the truth carry its own weight instead of forcing it. Eleanor smiled, watching her granddaughter's small silhouette dart across the darkening grass, golden light flickering in cupped hands. I had a good teacher in patience, she said softly. Frank used to tell me it was the only inheritance worth leaving anyone. She thought, in that quiet moment, of the woman she had been 18 months earlier. The woman who smiled politely through comments about vintage dining tables, who let herself wonder, even briefly, if perhaps she really was imagining things, if perhaps 71 really was an age at which a woman's own careful observations could no longer be trusted. That woman felt very far away now. Not because the hurt of those years had entirely disappeared. Some wounds, Eleanor had learned, simply become part of the landscape a person learns to live within, rather than something that vanishes completely. But because she had proven to herself, in the hardest possible way, that quiet did not mean weak, and patience did not mean surrender, and a woman who had spent decades being underestimated could, when it truly mattered, build something no one saw coming until it was already standing. If you have ever been the person everyone assumed would simply absorb whatever was done to them, the one expected to keep the peace, to smile through the small cruelties, to doubt your own clear-eyed observations because someone told you, again and again, that you were simply imagining things, I hope Eleanor's story reminds you of something important tonight. Silence is not the same as surrender. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones already building something the rest of the world will only understand once it's finished. Have you ever had to fight for the truth inside your own family, even when it cost you people you loved? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, wherever you're watching from tonight. And if Eleanor's story moved you the way it moved me to write it, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more, because there are so many more stories like hers still waiting to be told. The trap was already set before the story even began. And by the time anyone else understood what Eleanor had built in that quiet nightstand drawer, it was already far, far too late for anyone to stop it.